In Ephesians chapter 6, the first 4 verses, we read, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." In our previous studies, we have focused on the first 2 verses, looking at the parent-child relationship, and we've had 4 good studies, I think, looking at those verses. Last week, we began looking at verse 4, and this statement where it says, "Fathers, bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." And so we see there, as we looked, we did a good bit of study on the parents or the children's responsibility to the parents and somewhat the parents' responsibility to the children in those first studies that we've had. Last week, we began looking at some responsibilities that fathers in particular have towards their children, and this idea of not provoking them to wrath, and then therefore bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of God. And so when looking at this phrase, "do not provoke your children to wrath," we looked at how that this admonition could also be considered a sort of submission. And so in some fashion, the parents, the fathers in particular in this passage, are submissive to their children in that they have certain responsibilities toward them and certain duties that they must fulfill in reference to their children. We looked at how that this word provoke means to exasperate, to frustrate, to do these things that would cause our children to be frustrated in a manner that's not good for them. You know, sometimes when we discipline our children and do things that they don't necessarily like, they might be frustrated, but this is a different type of frustration. It's an unnecessary frustration. Sometimes it is necessary for us to make our children mad or maybe to upset them, but this is an unnecessary frustration that we're talking about here. And so we don't want to do things that will cause our children to be lost. We don't want to lose our children. That's the goal of every parent, is to raise our children in a manner that they will be faithful Christians, that they will be good people, that they will help their fellow man, and that therefore they will be faithful and ultimately be saved. And so we don't want to do anything that's going to cause our children to be lost, to have a hard heart, to be bitter against the church and things of that nature. And so a parent must understand the personality of his child and mold those inherited traits in such a way that they will not provoke rebellion and hatred. And so this idea of trying to understand our children, we need to endeavor to do that. Children can vary wildly between one another, and the personality traits of one child can be vastly different than that of another child. And so it takes effort on the parts of parents and fathers in particular. A lot of times mothers seem like they inherently understand the children maybe more than the fathers do, and probably a lot of that is the time that they spend with our children. And so as fathers, it may take a little more effort on our part to get in there, to understand our children, to know what's going on, to be involved in their life. And this takes time, and it's more than just something that we're going to do in passing, in a couple of minutes as we come in from work, pat them on the head and understand them. It's going to take more than that. And so this is a huge responsibility when we decide to become parents and fathers. And so we need to take that seriously and be willing to put in the time that it takes to do that properly. And so as we were finishing up last week, we were looking at some ways that we as fathers can provoke our children. And of course, we mentioned this, that this is not necessarily something that just is limited to the time that they're in the house with us. As parents, sometimes it's easy for us to provoke our children as they become adults. When they begin making decisions that we might not necessarily agree with, they're not necessarily a sin, but it's not how we would do things. Sometimes we can begin provoking them even as adults or young adults as they begin to get out on their own and make a life for themselves. But definitely when they're still under our care in our home, we can provoke them to wrath by the things that we are doing. Just the first few that we talked about very, very quickly for those who may not have been here. The first one was being overly harsh with discipline and rules. A child needs discipline, they need rules, but we can be overly harsh as we implement those, and the way we carry those things out can provoke our children to wrath. Inconsistency, that is definitely something that frustrates a child. A child needs consistency. They need to know that if I do this, this is going to happen. And it's very cruel for us as parents to be inconsistent, to maybe punish at one time, but then not punish when they do the same thing another time. And it confuses a child, and it can frustrate them. And when they don't know that this is definitely going to happen when I do these things. And so we need to be consistent in our rules and in our discipline, consistent from one child to the next. And that comes up with favoritism. We talked a little bit about favoritism last week. And we need to treat all of our children fairly, even though we may connect more with one child than another. Maybe our hobbies and things of that nature align more with one child than they do another. And a lot of times we can fall into the trap of showing favoritism to the child that we connect the most with. But we need to take the time and the effort to connect with all of our children and not show favoritism in any manner whatsoever. And then neglect and abandonment. This could be physical neglect and abandonment, but it also could be emotional neglect and abandonment. We could take care of our children physically, but yet neglect them emotionally and spiritually. And so definitely this might provoke our children to wrath along those lines. And so as we continue on with some of these that I have, and you may have others as well, and feel free to speak up as we go through if you have any comments or anything that you'd like to make. The next one I have is verbal abuse. And a lot of times you have parents who may not ever really raise a hand to their children, but yet they are very verbally abusive toward their children. And this could be criticizing or belittling a child with harsh words, insults, constant negative feedback. This can deeply wound a child. This can affect their self-esteem. This can provoke feelings of anger and inadequacy, and this can stretch out over their whole life. The things that we are saying to our children at a very young age, as they're forming their personalities and their self-perception and their outlook on life. As they are doing that, we need to be sure that our words are encouraging them and not provoking them, not breaking them down. We need to encourage our children. We don't want to do it in such a way that they are going to think too highly of themselves. But definitely we don't want to be overcritical. We don't want to use harsh words and insults on these children in a way that's going to provoke them to wrath and damage them emotionally. Any comments about that? Yes.
Unless you spend the time, you're not going to be taken seriously. If you're busy enhancing your money-making capabilities, you can spend most of your day just figuring out how to get that next biggest house and buy that big car and add up that bank account. But those kids, they don't get that.
Yeah.
And if you're not going to spend time with that child, why should they listen to you? And after a while, they're going to begin to sense that you just don't want to be around them.
Yeah.
And once that sets in, it's over. It's gone. You could have a 4 or 5-year-old kid just stop listening to you forever. At 4 or 5 years old, they'll pick up on the fact that you just don't want to be around them. So, you can talk about all these fine points, consistency, and a father, right? He's trying to arm that that child getting ready for the, step out that door and pee. But, you've got to spend time.
Yep.
You got to spend the time. If you did the same with your wife, honey, I told you I love you last month, if you don't want to be around them, they're going to pick up on that, and your words are just going to fall on the floor.
Yeah, our children they're very perceptive. Children, even at a very young age, are very perceptive. And so they can understand that if you want to be around them or not. And as I look back over my childhood, and even with my grandparents, it wasn't necessarily the things they were buying or the expensive vacations. The things that I remember most fondly, I guess, about my childhood are things like my grandfather taking me to the flea market to trade day, and things like that. And so the children remember the time, not necessarily the things that were spent on them. So very, very good point. We need to be sure that we are willing to spend the time. Any other comments? Another thing that, along with verbal abuse, is unrealistic expectations. And so sometimes we can be unrealistic in what we expect our children to do. And so this can be at a young age as well as later in life. Sometimes we want to push our children to be everything that they can be, to fulfill what's within them, their capabilities. We want them to do what they can do, and I think this is scriptural, but yet we don't want to be unrealistic in our expectations of what we are asking our children to do. Expecting children to perform at a level beyond their capability can create frustration. And so here again, we are looking at this provoking our children to wrath, frustrating them. And so expecting them to do something beyond their capabilities can be frustrating for a child. Now, sometimes we need to push our children to try to exceed their limits, to try to grow, because what they may not have the capability to do today, they can gain that capability. And we need to be willing to push our children to get to the point where they are capable of doing some things. But yet, if they fail to do that on their way, we need to be willing to sympathize with that and not use the harsh words and things to break them down. Unrealistic standards can make children feel inadequate as though they are constantly failing. And so we don't need to allow our children to get to the point where they feel like they're a constant failure, like they can never do anything to please us. And we need to be willing to build them up with our words, to push them in the proper direction. But as they fail, be willing to be there to pick them up and to understand, as long as they're doing their best, then that makes us happy and we're pleased with that. And so we need to be sure that we use our words and our expectation properly, because both can be great motivators, but yet they can also tear down and frustrate our children. So unrealistic expectations can provoke our children to wrath. Any comments along those lines?
One thing you may, you might be able to get this, is comparing our children against each other. Why are you not as good as, your brother or your sister?
Yeah.
That has all problems.
Yeah. We don't want to compare them. We don't want to compare them against each other. We want the standard to be the scriptures, not their older brother or sister or something like that. And so that can really frustrate a child. Good point. Any other comments? The next one I have on my list is lack of emotional support. And so as fathers, this can be difficult for us to show emotion and to support not only our children, but our family emotionally, because a lot of times we as men want to pack down those emotions and not really express those like we should. But we want to support them emotionally, but yet we want to acknowledge or validate our children's emotions as well. And so we don't want to discount any emotions that they may have. If a child is feeling sad, we want to understand why are you sad. Maybe we need to explain to them that really there's no reason to be sad, and this is the reason you shouldn't be sad. But we don't want to just brush that off. We want to try to understand the emotion, understand the anger maybe that sometimes a child feels. And one thing when we were beginning to adopt and we were going through some training, one thing that the social worker told us as we were getting ready to bring this teenager in is sometimes don't look at the action, look at what caused the action. What's behind that? Why is this child angry, or what's causing them to act out? And a lot of times, if you can understand the emotion behind the action, it kind of changes your perception of what's going on. And instead of, maybe discipline needs to be applied, but yet the discipline would be different because now you understand where that frustration is coming from. It could be from a lack of communication. They just didn't understand, or it could be a lot of different things. And so this is key, I think, when we're dealing with our children, is understanding the emotion. Maybe they're just mad because they didn't get their way and they're pitching a fit, as we say. And so we understand that. And so then we can administer the proper type of discipline. But maybe they're feeling frustrated because, like David said, they feel like we're comparing them to their sibling. And so they're frustrated, they're acting out. Maybe they still need discipline, but maybe we need to change our tact as well. And so we need to be willing to support them emotionally, to understand them. Children need to feel heard and understood, especially in times of emotional stress or some sort of emotional struggle. And so endeavoring to understand the emotions of our child and to validate those emotions. Sometimes we might need to say, you have a right to be angry. You have a right, maybe the sibling did something, or maybe something unfair happened at school, or something like that. I understand why you are angry. Validate that emotion. But even though you're angry, you can't do this. So while we validate that emotion, we correct that child and we send them in the proper direction. And so we can do these things, but again, like Kent said, it takes time, it takes involvement, it takes more than just passing through administering discipline without really understanding the situation. And we need to sit down and speak to the child and understand that. Any comments along those lines? And the last one I have on my list is setting a bad example. If a father doesn't model good behavior or live by the values that he's trying to teach his children, it can confuse or frustrate the children. What is more frustrating than a person being hypocritical in the way that they are dealing with you? Telling you you shouldn't do something when you know that they're going to turn around and do the same thing. We don't need to be hypocritical as we deal with our children. We need to set a good example. Hypocrisy is a big cause of anger and frustration, even among us as an adult. If we're looking, or if we're working for an employer and we see him acting hypocritical, that frustrates us. That makes us angry as we deal with people in our everyday lives. How much more will it frustrate this little human that doesn't really understand everything, and they see, one of the most important people in their life acting hypocritical? It's going to frustrate them. It's going to anger them. It's going to confuse them. It's going to teach them, well, when I get older, then I can be hypocritical as well. And so it's a dangerous thing to be hypocritical, to tell a child. How many of us have heard the phrase, do what I say and not what I do? And that really gets you nowhere. That gets you nowhere with your children, because ultimately they will probably pattern their life after what you are doing and not what you are saying. And so it's very important for us as fathers to set a good example, to not be hypocritical, to tell our children to do one thing and then we turn around and do the opposite. because they will see that and they will pattern their life after what we are doing the vast majority of the time. And so these are a few of the ways that I came up with and did some research, was reading and looked at how we as fathers can provoke our children. Does anybody have any other that they want to add on or maybe add to some of the things that I've said already about this? I think it's been good for us to take a deep look at this, because as fathers, we need to understand this and how important it is. And I personally needed to be reminded of these things. All right, as we look at the next phrase in verse 4, it says, "But bring them up." So, and you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up. So raising godly children is not easy to do. We must bring them up. We cannot leave it to the world to raise our children, because the world would gladly take on that responsibility, but they're going to take them in a direction that is vastly different than the direction that they need to go. So as fathers, we not only do not provoke them, but yet we have an active role in bringing them up and pointing them in the right direction. And so if we neglect that responsibility, if we don't fulfill our obligations there, then it's going to be a great tragedy, because as I said, the world is going to step in and they're going to take them in a direction that we don't want them to go. The influence of one's parents will extend throughout the entire life. Last week, we heard from David and Gary about the influence of their fathers and their mothers, and how even today, I mean, these guys are pushing some pretty old years here. And even today, decades later, they're still feeling that influence. And so this is going to be something that our children, if the Lord blesses them with a long life, they will look back on in their later years and will remember, and that influence will still be there. You look at Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6. It says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." And so this is talking about the entire span of one's life. Train them up when they are young, and as they are old, then they're going to remember those things, and they're going to be more likely to stay in the path that you are directing them to. Parents who love their children will instruct, they will live the example, and they will discipline their children. And so this is more than just, not provoking our children. This is an active role. It's not just something that we don't do. It's something that we take action on and we are involved in and are an active part in. So it's not provoking, but it's living the example. It's disciplining our children, instructing them as well. Speaking to the children of Israel, God says in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 and 16, it says, "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. In that I command you today that to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land in which you possess." And so here God is telling the children of Israel, and we'll look at these, some of these passages as well in Deuteronomy, how he instructs the children of Israel to deal with their children, but yet he wanted to make sure that they were walking in his ways, keeping his commandments, and living the example. And so we even today need to do this same thing. If we are going to even have a small hope of successfully raising our children, we must be walking in the path that we want them to go on. The lesson of obedience is difficult to learn, but it's also difficult to teach. Both of them are difficult. And so it's not something that we're just going to haphazardly do. This is something that's difficult, that we have to be, we have to do with what am I trying to think? I've lost the word. But we have to try to do. We have to try to do. And so we're just not going to fall into it. It's hard to tell them what to do, but to teach them to obey is also difficult. We want to, when you tell a child, do not touch the candy, and you leave the room, and then the child will either touch the candy or they won't. They know what you said, but will they obey you when you're not around? And that's a difficult thing for a parent to instill into a child. They know what you said, but do they have the respect for you that they are not going to touch that candy when you leave the room, or maybe even you may go out and run an errand or something like that? Are they going to have enough respect for you to leave that candy alone? And so I know all of our children, and we even did when we were children, we would touch the candy at times. But hopefully our parents got us to the point where we would not touch that candy because we respected their authority and we wanted to please them and ultimately please God. Teaching respect for authority and love for God and fellow man are difficult yet essential lessons. Parents need to give much attention to the responsibility of training their children in the right way. And so here again, we just keep reiterating this point that it takes time, it takes effort to fulfill these responsibilities. And so we must be willing to do that. And so we not only do not provoke our children to wrath, but we also bring them up. Any comments on that phrase or those comments that we just made?
Shane, one thought here. Back when I guess, my younger years, teenage years, I worked an awful lot. We got Christian, but he was brought up, we were born in the 30s, so he come up through some hard times. But anyway, he would always feel this was all his nephews, because we all worked together.
Yeah.
And he'd say, boys, to have respect for other people, you gotta have respect for yourself first. We didn't like it when he said that, it's one of those things he said so much to us that it stuck with us, Yeah. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
Let's get back to that.
All right. Any other comments?
Shane?
Yes.
Comment about that Proverbs 22:6 reading.
Yes.
Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. I think if we just give a minute of thought there, when that child is old, we're gone. In this very auditorium, Brother Tucker made a comment, things he does or did in his life were governed by what his father taught him and how he honored his father. He honored his father's name, his reputation in the community by the way he conducted himself. So if we can do this successfully, when we're gone, our children will honor our teaching. They'll honor the scripture. When we're not here with an eye on them, and I know many people in here do what they do because of what their parents taught them. That thought concept brings to my mind John chapter 20, verse 29. Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. The idea of our parents being gone and we still honor them and honor the training can probably be paralleled, at least in my mind, of how we've never seen Jesus. We've just learned his teaching and we see his example and we obey and honor him, and we've not even seen him. He's not here.
Yeah.
He's been gone for 2,000 years. But if we love him, if we respect him, if we value that covenant relationship with him, then we honor him in our actions. And if we can be successful at this and raise our children properly, then we don't have to worry about it. If they're the type of people they should be, they'll honor us, they'll honor God in the way they live and what they teach generations to come. It's a powerful scripture.
Yeah, it is. Very powerful. Very powerful thing that, you know, as a young parent, I think it's difficult for us to understand the power that we are given to direct generationally, I guess you could say, with our children. You know, we became parents at age 21, and I don't think we fully understood the power that we had to affect the future generations of our family. But it's a great power that you're given to mold these little minds and to put them on the path, and therefore you're putting them in that direction, and then their children and their children, and so it just keeps going. And so very good point. Very good point. Any other comments there? All right, so we are to bring them up. How are we to bring them up? Well, the King James Version says in the training and admonition of the Lord. And so we look at this passage, or this word training. The King James Version says to nurture. And so Paul uses two words here in this verse to indicate the direction the parents should take in bringing up their children. They should bring them up in the nurture, the training, and the admonition of the Lord. So he shows both the positive, the nurture, the admonition, the negative, the ways in which we should do this. The instructive and disciplinary aspects of parenting. And so this is kind of a two-pronged kind of attack here that we are taking, that both of these avenues that we are using to get our children on the right path, to instruct them in the way that they should go, both the nurture and the admonition. The first word, nurture or training, is from the same Greek word that is translated chastening. And so we can see this used in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 17. It says, if you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons, or what son is there whom a father does not chasten? And so this carries with it the idea of educating, training, and instructing. And so sometimes there is disciplinary correction that is necessary as we go about this. Other times it's just speaking to our children and showing them the right way. And so we may ask, well, how is this training to be done? And so we talked a little bit about how God instructed the Israelites through Moses as they were coming out of the land, or coming out of Egypt, as they were traveling, going into the land of Canaan. You know, he was telling them all of these things. And so we see in Deuteronomy chapter 6 how that he began by saying this is a personal commitment on your part. And so if we read there, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, it says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. And so, you know, as he begins to instruct the Israelites on how they should interact with their children, he begins by commanding personal commitment out of the parents. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And so we see that this is a personal commitment to the truth. The Lord our God is one Lord, as we see in verse 4 of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And so it's a personal commitment to the truth. It's a personal commitment with devotion. Love with all your heart. So we are fully devoted to God. And then it's a personal commitment with sincerity. These words shall be in your heart. And so this is not just something we are saying. This is something that we believe is in our heart. We live it. We're not just play acting. We're not being hypocritical, because as we said, children are very perceptive, and they can see that hypocrisy. And so if we are going to be the proper type of parents, we are going to have to do like the Israelites were instructed to do, and first of all, be personally committed to God. And then, along with the personal commitment, we see personal communication. And so if we continue reading there in Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, "You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." And so that begs the question, when do we not instruct our children? I mean, basically, it's a 24/7 deal. We are looking for those opportunities to put those little snippets of wisdom into those minds, those mushy little minds that are forming. You know, we're trying to insert those things into those minds at every opportunity that we have, because they are forming, they haven't become rigid, and so we see opportunities, we need to stop and we need to take those opportunities. And so it's a personal commitment for us to obey God, but yet it's a commitment to do this as well. And so this personal communication is done with our words. You know, the knowledge of God was passed from generation to generation by the fathers who diligently taught the things of God to their children. And so this is a generational thing, as Tim was talking about. From generation to generation, fathers are instilling these things into their children with their words. But then also by their example. Verse 8 shows us this. Even when there was silence, there was to be a visible commitment to the law of God. Children will walk in your shoes. Children will walk in your shoes. I mean, I can remember as a young child, we always had a big garden growing up, and Dad would be out using the tiller, and of course, as the soil behind the tiller would be very soft, and I can remember walking behind him, stepping where he had stepped, trying to follow in his shoes. And that's a very literal thing there, but yet children do that in their spiritual lives, in the way they interact with people. They are very literally following in our shoes. They're stepping in those footprints that we leave behind. And so we need to understand that and know, as we are walking that path, we are leading these young children down that path. And we need to make sure that there's no issues with them stepping in our footsteps. Are those footsteps going to lead them in a way, in a place they don't need to go, to a place they don't need to go? And so they were very literally follow us. If we have habits that we don't want them to have, then we need to overcome those. I mean, it could be anger, it could be something like, smoking or drinking or cursing or something. We need to get a hold of those, or our children are going to follow down that same path. It's not always, but there's a good chance that they will. We need to get a hold of those things and make sure that we are leaving footsteps that we would want them to walk in. And so along with our words and our example, then we create an environment that's going to be conducive for these things to grow and develop in our children's minds and in their habits. Even when parents are not at home, the children should be able to see the love of God throughout the house. And so we need to create a home that our children come into and they feel our love and the love of God in that home. Are we creating that home? Or when our children come in, do they have memories of, right there's where Dad does this? He goes out on the front porch to do this. Or, things of that nature. They come in and they're reminded of the bad things. Rather than, there's a table where we sit around and pray before we eat our meals. There's where I sit and talk to Mom while she's cooking about things. And she's telling me what she thinks and advising me. Is that what they see, the environment that they feel when they come into the house? We need to make available to them positive, spiritually uplifting themes in our home. Are we making those things available? And so we bring them up in the nurture, in the training that they should have and should develop as young children. Any comments along those lines? I don't know that we have a lot of time to get into admonition here, but we might just go ahead and kind of finish up there instead of getting started on the next one. But, of course, as we said, this is a two-pronged approach in the training, the nurture, and the admonition. And so, Lord willing, next week we will pick up there in the last part of verse 4 and look at the admonition. We'll go ahead and should finish up this section and move into the kind of the servant or employee relationship with the employer or the master, and be looking at that as well as we continue on there in verse 5. And so I appreciate everyone's attention. Those who made comments, thank you so much for the comments. And Lord willing, we will pick up there next week. Thank you.